As you continue your Final Fantasy journey, you'll eventually be presented with group content such as dungeons that you'll need to complete to progress. And as is true for most things when doing them for the first time, this can be a bit anxiety-inducing, as there does tend to be this worry that you'll mess up or that you'll be judged for making mistakes and or just not knowing what you're doing. But again, like is generally true with these fears of doing something new, they're usually not warranted. In fact, you'll quickly learn that not only is group content such as dungeons rather easy, but also most people would rather see you succeed than fail. But still, to help alleviate any misgivings you may have about jumping into the duty finder, here are some tips for doing dungeons. Starting off, let's talk about the different roles and how they function in a party. In total, there are 3 different roles that you'll find yourself interacting with, those being the tanks, the healers, and the DPS. Something which is commonly referred to in the greater gaming community as the Holy Trinity, as it is a time-tested standard found in countless other games beyond just MMOs. It's for this reason that you'll likely have at least some idea of how these will function, assuming that you've played other games with the Trinity, which you probably have. Starting with the tank role, they're the most durable of the 3, able to consistently take large or sustained damage with relative ease, which is good as it helps enable their role in the party, which is keeping the enemy's attention to divert damage away from the less durable healers and DPS. They do this by generating large amounts of enmity or aggro through the use of their tank stance, something which every tank has, and while active it is near impossible to lose aggro on a target unless it's to another tank. But the opposite is true as well, as if you do fail to turn on your tank stance, it's unlikely that you'll be able to produce enough enmity to actually keep the enemy's attention. With that little summary out of the way, let's go over a couple of tips. First, if not made clear in the summary, you always want to make sure to have your tank stance active anytime you go into a dungeon, as without it you'll be unable to maintain aggro, leaving most likely the DPS to take the attacks. Next, let's talk about mitigations. There are 2 common mistakes that new tanks tend to make involving their cooldowns. The first of these is the idea that you need to save cooldowns, whether offensive or defensive, for bosses. And this couldn't be further from the truth, because generally in 14, dungeon bosses tend to serve as skill checks, meaning usually they won't do all that much damage unless you're constantly making mistakes and getting hit by avoidable attacks. Now, on the other hand, the mob pools in between the different bosses usually serve as endurance checks, as normally they don't do anything outside of basic AoEs or auto attacks, but because of the sheer number of them, they do tend to do a fair amount of damage, almost exclusively to the tanks, and it's for this reason that you'll almost always want to use your cooldowns for these mob packs rather than the bosses. Speaking of which, the second mistake that new tanks tend to make in reference to their mitigations comes in the form of stacking, or using multiple cooldowns together. You see, while this does further reduce the overall damage you'll be taking, it's normally not the best way to go, because as mentioned before, mob pools are endurance checks, and thus your goal is to last as long as possible. This is why it's usually better to roll your cooldowns, which consists of using a new mitigation when the old one is about to expire, extending your overall mitigation time, helping you and your healer avoid any unmitigated damage. The last step has to do with positioning, primarily in reference to bosses. As a general rule, you want to aim to move as little as you physically can, making sure to keep the boss pointed away from the party. And the reason for this is twofold. First, keeping the boss in one position allows the DPS, most notably the melee, to easily execute their abilities and thus do more damage. And the second reason is that it helps avoid collateral damage, as it's very easy for other players to be killed because the boss either has a cleave or has an AoE tank buster. And in some other cases, the boss might do attacks based on the direction they're facing, and so having the boss in a consistent position allows your party to more easily dodge said attacks. Moving on to our next role, we have the healers. As the name implies, their main role is keeping the party alive, which they either do through strong bursty heals, regens, or powerful shields depending on the type of healer. And that's about it for the description, honestly, so let's move right into the tips. Starting with the idea of efficiency. The most common mistake new healers will make actually comes with healing too much, which may sound odd, but it's true. You see, healing in Final Fantasy XIV is less about keeping people at max health and more about getting the most out of your heals. The best example of this is why it may just Cure 1. The moment that you unlock Cure 2, it becomes effectively worthless, because why cast 2 cheaper heals when you could just use one stronger one instead? Furthermore, you can replace one of those 2 casts with a damaging spell, which actually helps you kill the enemies faster, and as a result, reduces the damage that needs to be healed. Another example is with Scholar's Shield. Because you want to get the most out of your heals, rarely do you actually want to spam your shield ability, as doing so will just overwrite the previous one, leading to the rest of that shield being wasted. So to avoid this, you normally want to alternate between your shield and your normal heal during damage heavy sections as to not waste that shield. The next tip is that your damage as a healer does actually matter, especially early on since so few jobs have AoE starting out, and spreading your dot to all the different targets is actually a decent source of AoE in the early levels. But beyond that, there's also the fact that the faster you kill enemies, the less damage they're able to do, and thus the less damage that you have to heal, which is why the previous tip of efficiency is so important, as being more efficient with your heals allows you to do more damage and thus reduce the overall healing that is needed. And our last tip is a rather small one about Asuna, which is a job action that allows you to remove certain debuffs from an ally. The way you can tell if a debuff can be removed is actually by looking at the debuff's icon. You see, if a debuff has this small blue line above it, that actually means that it can be removed with Asuna. If it doesn't have this line, then it can't be removed. On to our last role, we have the DPS, whose only job is to do as much damage as possible, and that's basically it, which is why we're just going to go straight into the tips. If you find yourself playing a melee DPS, then you'll have to learn how to do positionals, which are attacks that gain bonus effects or damage if executed at either the enemy's flank or the rear, depending on the ability. And as a new player, it can be somewhat confusing as to what counts as the rear or the flank, but there's actually a really easy way to tell the difference. If you target an enemy, you should see a circle under them showing their hitbox, and at the back of the circle you will notice that there's a wedge missing. This is actually the enemy's rear, and where the circle starts to begin is where the flank starts. Also, if you ever see an enemy with a complete circle with no missing wedge, that means that enemy actually has no positionals, and thus your positionals against that enemy will always count as if you did it correctly. Moving on to a more general DPS tip, like was mentioned in the tanking tips, don't just save your abilities for bosses, as you want to make sure to kill the mob packs as fast as possible to help both your tanks and healers, which leads straight into our next tip of using your utility. You want to use things like Addle and Feint to help reduce the damage that's being dealt. You want to use your defensives like Second Wind or Bloodbath to help out your healer, and you want to use stuns and interrupts to just help stop attacks. While your main job is to do DPS, that doesn't mean you can't help out in other ways. You have these abilities, so make use of them. With roles covered, let's move on to limit breaks, which are special actions unique to parties of 4 or more people, and do different things depending on the role of the person that uses them, along with how much limit break the party actually has built. Speaking of which, it does need to be noted that limit break is a party resource, meaning that only one person can use it. So if the DPS was to use the LB, the healer then couldn't follow up with their own until the party built up another bar. But what do limit breaks actually do? Well, as I said, it depends. If a tank uses it, then it becomes a party mitigation. If a healer uses it, it becomes an AoE heal, and at level 3, it raises dead players. If a melee uses it, it becomes a powerful single target attack. If a caster uses it, it becomes a powerful circle AoE. And lastly, if a ranged DPS uses it, it becomes a powerful line AoE. Now, limit break can reach up to 3 levels with a party of 8 people. However, in the case of dungeons, you'll usually only ever see level 1, and very rarely will you see level 2. But how do you actually build limit break? Well, by default, as long as you have a party of 4 or more people, it will actually generate passively, with your party getting about a bar every few minutes. However, that's not the only way you're actually able to build LB, as there are some things you can do to build it more actively. The easiest of which for new players is by interrupting enemy attacks, either by stunning them or using actual interrupt skills like head graze, which, as a bonus tip, if you want to tell if an attack can be interrupted, all you need to do is look at the enemy's cast. If the cast bar for the attack is blinking like this, that means that attack can be stopped with abilities like head graze. But if the attack doesn't have a blinking cast bar, that means the only way that that attack can be interrupted is by stunning the target if they're able to be stunned. I should also note, when it comes to building LB with interrupts, the amount can actually depend from instance to instance or enemy to enemy, to the point that sometimes you may be rewarded with LB, but others you may not. It just depends. Also, of the active methods, this is the only one I would recommend as a new player because it's just a good habit to get into anyways. That being said, the other methods consist of surviving lethal attacks through personal mitigations or shields. Invulns or debuff skills don't actually work for this. It has to be personal mitigation or a shield specifically. Next is healing someone that is under 10% health, killing adds in specific fights, and then doing certain mechanics correctly. Lastly, let's go over who should actually use the limit break. Well, in dungeons, it's almost always going to be the DPS. As for which DPS LB should you use, it just depends on how quickly you actually get the limit break. If you get it before the final boss and the party is still fighting a pack of mobs, then if there's a caster or range, they'll want to use it there. If not, then the melee will want to use it on whatever boss they fight next. Also, you generally want to try to use it as soon as you get it when it comes to dungeons, as sometimes you might actually get multiple limit breaks throughout a dungeon run, depending on the dungeon. The golden rule is just don't let it go to waste. With the rolls and limit breaks covered, let's take a look at some dungeon runs to kind of go over a couple things, starting again with tanks. In this clip, I'm going to do what is referred to as a wall-to-wall pull, meaning I'm pulling every enemy I can before I hit a wall that stops me from going any further. This is something that will become the standard as you get into the higher levels, and is something you should try to get comfortable with as you continue through your journey, but you don't need to rush, as most people do expect most ARR dungeons to go slower, so just do what you're comfortable with starting out. Anyways, back to the clip. During this first pull, even though I have two mitigations at this level in the form of Rampart and Reprisal, I only use Rampart on this pull, as I don't want to stack my cooldowns, and by the time Rampart is about to end, the enemies are almost dead. And since I didn't use my Reprisal on that first pull, it means I can use it on the next one, which I can make a little bigger, as I have the extra mitigation to handle more enemies. Now, something to keep in mind, especially early on, is your limits and the limits of your party. In truth, I was slightly undergeared for this dungeon, which is why I had to be a bit cautious with doing bigger pulls, as 2 packs was likely my limit, maybe more if I had Rampart up since we had 2 bards, but I didn't really want to risk it. In fact, in this clip, both my Rampart and Reprisal are on cooldown, so I did a single pull, not wanting to risk anything more without mitigations. Now, keep in mind, as I said, this run was with me being under-geared. If I was properly geared, then I could have rather easily wall-to-wall the whole dungeon, which is to say you do want to try to keep your gear somewhat up to date, as it can make a big difference. Moving on to healer, in this clip you'll see a tank doing a rather large pull, but instead of just spamming Cure 1 on them, I mostly focused on spreading my dot to all the different enemies while the tank takes some damage, at which point I started healing, alternating between casting my Cure 1 and attacking a different enemy, keeping the tank alive while also killing enemies faster than if I was to just sit there healing the whole time. And while it may be a bit scary having the tank not at full health, at no point were they actually in any danger of dying, because by watching how much initial damage they took from the pack, I was able to get a good handle on how much damage the pack was doing overall, and thus I got a good idea of when I needed to heal to keep them alive. And part of that does come with experience, but as a general rule, you're usually safe to let a tank drop to around 60% before you need to think about healing them. Now onto our last role, DPS. And truth be told, there isn't actually all that much I have to say, or in this case, show for them, as DPS is by far the simplest role when it comes to dungeons, as all they have to care about is using their abilities to do damage. That and staying alive, of course. So with that being the case, here's a couple of clips of me using Limit Break, because you do want to try and use it every dungeon if possible, because again, there's no reason to let it go to waste. It's free damage for your party, and it can help speed things up. That being said, if you're really worried about doing your first dungeon, then doing it as a DPS is probably the best way to go, as it basically becomes a game of follow the leader. Of course, there is also the duty support system you can take advantage of, which allows you to go into any story dungeon with a group of NPCs, but in general, I recommend doing it with real players, if for nothing more than getting comfortable with doing so, as there are going to be at least some things you need to do with other people to progress, at least as things currently stand. But that's basically everything you need to know going into your first few dungeons, meaning this video is coming to its end. Now, this video is the second in a series going over various things in Final Fantasy XIV to hopefully help new players on their journey. The next episode will be going over crafting and gathering, and if it's already been released, then you'll be seeing a link for it on the screen shortly. If you found this video helpful, please consider liking it and possibly subscribing to the channel so you know when I release a new video. Also, feel free to ask any questions in the comments, and I'll do my best to try and answer them. But with all that being said, thanks for watching, and I wish you the best on your Final Fantasy journey.